Good evening, everyone. If you're joining us for the Book Club of California's online presentation for Monday, April 17th, I'm letting you know that you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments. So sit back, relax, and be patient, and we'll be starting shortly. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. If you've just joined us, we are going to be starting in just a moment. This is the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, April 17th, 2023. We have a lot of people registered for this event, so we're going to give them a minute or two to make it in from the waiting room and join us, and then we'll get started. So thanks for being here. Just a few minutes past the top of the hour, and as we wait another moment or two for folks to join us, I'll let you know that the chat and the Q&A are both enabled, so feel free to use both of those to talk to us, your presenters, and you can also should be able to talk to other attendees directly. Great. Okay, I think we're going to get started. Folks can join us kind of in progress, but we won't hold you up since you're all here and ready to go. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's program for Monday, April 17th, 2023. This is a virtual program, and it's titled about Continental Reckoning, the American West and the Age of Expansion, the new book from our speaker this evening, Elliott West. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California. It's my pleasure to welcome you and kind of MC the webinar. For those of you who might be new to the Book Club of California, I'll let you know that the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, book binding, book collecting, history, and much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed, or if you're just simply interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member or a donor. Membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. So now let's get into it. Let me introduce our speaker for this evening, Elliott West. Now, Elliott West, alumni distinguished professor of history at the University of Arkansas, is a specialist in the social and environmental history of the American West. He has written several books, including The Way to the West, Essays on the Central Plains, and The Contested Plains, Indians, Gold Seekers, and the Rush to Colorado, which was the winner of the Francis Parkman Prize. Now, Elliott West received his BA from the University of Texas and his PhD from the University of Colorado. Now, tonight, Elliott West will be talking about his latest book, Continental Reckoning, The American West in the Age of Expansion, published earlier this year by University of Nebraska Press. Continental Reckoning presents a sweeping narrative of the American West and its vital role in the transformation of the nation. In the 1840s, what we now call the West was home to vibrant native cultures and vague claims by other nations. 30 years later, it was organized into states and territories and bound into the nation and the world by an infrastructure of rails, telegraph wires, and roads, and by a racial and ethnic order, with its indigenous peoples largely dispossessed and confined to reservations. Now, as the West was acquired, integrated into the nation, and made over physically and culturally, the United States shifted onto a course of accelerated economic growth, a racial reordering and a redefinition of citizenship, engagement with science and technology, and greater involvement with the larger world itself. Elliott West's book has been called vivid and compelling, and it's also been called a sweeping history of how a dynamic region was made and remade in mid-19th century. So I'm thrilled to have Elliott with us this evening to talk about Continental Reckoning. Now, if you have questions or comments for the presenter or about the presentation itself, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We'll curate the questions and comments from the chat and the Q&A when I come back on screen towards the end of the hour for our discussion. And now it's my great pleasure to turn over the webinar to our speaker, Elliott West.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank all of you for tuning in. I appreciate it greatly. This is my first encounter with the Book Club of California, but it sounds like a wonderful organization. I plan to join myself just to take part in it. And as Kevin said, our presentation tonight will deal with the book that just came out recently, Continental Reckoning. Entitled this the talk, "The Birth of the West and the Making of Modern America." I hope that title will become clear as I move along, the relationship between those two things. But first, let's begin with what I think is a fact that's well enough known, but is I think woefully underappreciated. One of the most important facts of American history, I think, and that is, in 3 years, less than 3 years really, 1845 to 1848, the United States added roughly 1,200,000 square miles to its territory. Began in 1845 with the annexation of Texas. Next year, 1846, the acquisition of the Pacific Northwest with a treaty with Great Britain. That same year, 1846, we began our war with Mexico to the south, a war that lasted about 2 years. Over in early 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave us what we call the Mexican Cession, California on the Pacific coast, and roughly the American Southwest. Add all that together, considered as one event, those three events together as one event. The land that was acquired is more than half again the size of the Louisiana Purchase. It's about 750 million, that's with a B, 750 million acres. That's a lot of land. It's a lot of land, and it's a lot of people there, lots of resources to go see, a very geographically diverse area. What would that be like to get an idea of what we're talking about here? Ask yourself, what would it be like if during this took place over about 28 months and 15 days. So let's say between now and August 1st, 2025, the United States should acquire that much territory. What would it look like? Well, it would have us expanding if we can't go farther west because we'll get wet. But if we expand to the south with that much territory, the United States would now include all of Mexico, all of Central America, about 1/2 of Colombia. You think of it that way, you begin to get a sense that this is a transformative episode in America. Think of it another way. We would have added about as much country, just a little bit less than to be found in modern India. So what would happen in this country if we were suddenly embrace that much territory over this short span of time? Well, a lot. I think a lot would happen. It was changed very rapidly. The area that we acquired. This is a map from 1844. It's a map of the far west, of course. And if you were to be able to zoom into this map, you would see that it's just a hodgepodge of dozens of different native groups. This land also had been claimed in the past by Spain and then Mexico, by Great Britain, even parted by Russia. So this is a place that had, conflicting claims to it. It was a place that was a mosaic of these different native cultures. That's 1844. So there's no oneness to it. There's no singularity to this area. But moved in just 30 years or so, 30, 35 years in the future. And what do you see? Well, you see this. You see the region that we think of as the American West. California, of course, is critical to it. The American West, this whole area has been organized politically into states and territories. It has been bound into the nation and the world by new technologies of movement. It has been geographically, environmentally transformed over this short span of time. It's simply a different place physically than it was before. And it's been organized, not just politically, but organized also into sort of an economic and a racial order, of racial ordering structure. All of that in just 30 to 35 years. That's what I've tried to write about in this book. The book really has two basic purposes. The first is to describe what I call the birth of the American West, the emergence of this region that we know of as American West today. But at the same time, this is what I want to focus on this evening. At the same time, I became increasingly convinced that the emergence of the West was a critical episode, critical event, not just in the creation of this new part of America. It was a critically important episode and event in the shaping of a new America. These same years that we're talking about here were the ones in which the course of American history shifts onto a new trajectory, a trajectory that carries us into the 20th and the 21st century, carries us into what we think of as modern America. That's what I want to concentrate on this evening. How does the birth of the West, how is it connected to the birth of modern America? How are these two things related? I think it's instructive. I think it will help us understand where we are today and how we have come to be. This transition between these two images. Now, to do that, I thought we could use sort of like a thought experiment. That is, let's make a list and try to come up with a list of what you would call the defining traits, the defining elements of modern America, of the United States of the 20th and now 21st centuries. What are those traits? That is, that separate that period from a period a few generations before, let's say before 1850. How do we explain the emergence of those traits? How do we explain the coming of those differences, the creation of those differences? Come up with a list. Now take each element of that list and look back to the emergence of the West and ask yourself, is there any connection? Is there any connection? This particular thing defines modern America. Is there anything in the emergence of the West that helps us understand that particular trait and how it came to be? And I think you can come up with some pretty interesting examples of that. I'd like to look at three of them tonight. Three traits I think that we can all agree are fundamental to our understanding and defining the United States of the 20th and 21st century, and then look back and say to what extent that they might have their roots, their beginnings, or were affected by the appearance, the growth of the American West, the birth of the West. Okay, let's start out with one I think that is incontestable. The United States is today the 800-pound gorilla of the global economy. We have far and away the largest and most powerful economy in the history of humanity. Lots of talk nowadays about being challenged by other nations, especially China. But keep in mind, the GNP of the United States today is fully half again that of our next competitor, China. It is 5 times that of Germany. It is 8 times that of the United Kingdom. We are the king of the hill, and in terms of a raw economic power. Is there a connection between that? How do we, between the emergence of us as an economic superpower on the one hand, and the acquisition and the development of the American West on the other? I think there is. And I think it's when you look at it more closely, you find that it's pretty obvious and pretty striking. It begins with what I call in the book the great coincidence. The great coincidence. This has to do with California. California was acquired in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That was on February, was signed by this fellow on the left, Nicholas Trist, on February the 2nd, 1848. 9 days before Trist signed that treaty, this man, James Marshall, discovered this fleck of gold in the American River at the Sutter's Mill in northern California. A little flake of gold that was worth at the time about 50 cents. So these two things happened virtually simultaneously. Comes out to about 200 hours. Within 200 hours, the United States acquired California, and California began to be revealed as one of the richest places on earth. The California Gold Rush, starting in 1848-49, was far and away the greatest outpouring of gold from any single place in the history of humanity up until that time. More gold was produced in California in 1852, this one year, its banner year, than had been produced across the entire world in the 18th century. So, at the moment that we acquire the far west, at the moment that this expansion is formally completed with the signing of that treaty, we begin to see that what we have acquired, in fact, is this great storehouse of resources, starting with the raw definition of wealth that is gold. And then, of course, 10 years later, the discovery of silver in the Comstock lode. Here's a map that shows us the gold and silver discoveries in the West during the decades that followed. And you can see the West is simply peppered with these strikes. One after the other occurred. So what? What does that do? Well, this huge outpouring of wealth out of the West came at exactly the same time that the United States was retooling economically, socially, physically, into the new America that we would know in the 20th century. It was a huge undertaking and hugely expensive. The money to provide it, the money came in large part from the wealth pouring out of the West that we acquired almost immediately at the point that we discovered that we had this gold and silver. So it begins with gold and silver, with precious metals. But the farther we looked, the more we discovered that in fact we had all kinds of other resources. It became increasingly clear over the next years that the American West is this great treasure chest of all the resources that we would need for this transformation. The most important, the most valuable non-precious metal during this age of industrialization, age of economic expansion, is copper. Copper, turned out, this is a global copper production today. So this is today, but back at the time, the copper discovered in places like Montana and Arizona were the most productive copper mines on Earth at that time. Copper, it is crucially important for industrialization, for the wiring that you need for factories in this case, and of course also during these years, the wire for the telegraph, which is also being developed and spread during this time. Copper. How about the basic? We were leaving the age of wood to enter the age of iron and steel, but we still needed our wood. A lot of wood to like build railroads. A lot of woods to put to sink mines into the earth, to rebuild and remake the physical structures of the American West. And of course, in the West, in the Pacific Northwest in particular, we have these enormous supplies of wood that we will need. And you could go on and on. If you look a little more in the future, of course, petroleum and then uranium, coal. The American West today is far and away the greatest coal production in the nation today, far and away, is in the West, in places like Wyoming. So it's almost as if as we retool, as we become this new nation, we will realize we need certain things, certain resources, and all we need to do is sort of look around the West and we'll find them. The West then and its resources sort of fueled this economic transformation and this social and cultural transformation in these years. And it shows up in unexpected ways. For instance, we're all familiar with this episode in the 1870s and the great slaughter of the plains bison, the butchering of and the near extinction of what is today our national mammal. early 1870s, there were about 12 to 15 million plains bison left. A little more than 10 years later, that number had shrunk from 12 to 15 million to a bit more than 1,000. It's a 99.99996% decrease in a little more than 10 years. We're all familiar with this. But why did it happen? How do we explain this extraordinary collapse of this enormous population? Well, it was a matter of supply and demand. In the 1870s, early 1870s, there was a huge supply, a huge need for a vital resource, one of the most important resources of the time, and that is leather. And the need was found in factories. Factories at the time required a lot of leather for gaskets, for the belts of machines like this. Most of that leather had been provided up until then, from Argentina, from the great cattle herds in Argentina. But they were about run dry. There was a global shortage, especially in the modern industrializing world, a global shortage of leather. In 1872, it was discovered that, in fact, if you took a bison hide and shipped it back east to a tannery, it could be made into industrial leather. And so it starts. Within a few years, millions of bison are being killed, being slaughtered, being skinned, and the skins then shipped by rail back to the east, where they will be where they're being transformed into turned into leather that will be used in factories in the United States, in England, and across Europe. So the very killing and the processing of the bison hides, you can see on this slide, itself had a kind of industrial feel to it. It's like it's like industry come to the Great Plains in this case, with devastating effects on this enormous animal. So in a sense, you could say, what happened to the bison? Well, the factories ate them. And the factories that were necessary for the modernizing America consumed the bison for their own needs. Okay, so I think we can say, without too much argument, that one of the ways in which the emergence of the West is connected to the emergence of modern America, in this case, it's an economic superpower, is because the West has proved over time, again and again and again, and in spades, to be the great storehouse, the great resource, the great reservoir of resources for this new America. What else? What else can you say that defines modern America? One of the ones you might not think of in connection to the West, but one is, I should say, also the industrialization is shown in other parts of Western developments, like in California. I gave you this slide because of the book club of California. Wheat production in California is basically an industrial enterprise during this time, with these gigantic mega farms that are worked by new agriculture machinery, gang labor. It's again sort of like a factory, like an industrial operation. In this case, the production of grains in California. What else? Well, I think America is also undeniably the great scientific superpower of the world. That's just sort of as background to this, sort of as an illustration of it. I went back and looked up the Nobel Prizes over the past 10 years and just asked the question of all those Nobel Prizes in science, in the sciences that were awarded, how many of them went to scientists in the United States? The number of Nobel laureates in the United States during those years in the scientific awards is roughly equal to the number of laureates in the next 6 nations after us. We, just as in our economic clout, we are a nation that is clearly, the scientific leader of these of modern America, of the modern world. As I said, you don't normally associate that scientific developments with the birth of the West. We normally think of lonesome cowboys and homesteaders, but in fact, what I discovered in my research was, in fact, the West was arguably the great world laboratory for a whole range of sciences. There's another coincidence going on here. These same years that we see the birth of the West, these are the years in which there were enormous advances, spectacular advances in one science after another. And over and over, in one science after another, we see so much of the most important work being done out West. We could look at many examples of this. We could look at geology, certainly. We could look at anthropology. We could look at meteorology. We could look at oceanography. All of these sciences, in all of these areas, the American West was one of the great centers of operations of investigation. But what I'd like to do, as an example of this, is to focus on one particular one that was especially important during these years, and that is paleontology, the search for ancient forms of life. To try to fill in the longest story in the world of the evolution of life, evolution of life over these incomparable and unimaginable amounts of time. This, of course, was directly involved with what was the most contentious idea of the day, and that was Charles Darwin's theories of evolution through natural selection that he wrote about in the origin of species, published in 1849. 1850. So Darwin's ideas, were being documented through geology, which shows this unimaginable length of time that life was unfolding on Earth, and especially through paleontology to show the ancient forms that preceded those in the world today. Well, the West was by far the most active place on Earth in the study and the pursuit of paleontology during these years. There were dozens, hundreds really, of new species, ancient species that were discovered through the bone hunting out West. The two men most closely associated with this, most famously associated with this, were these two: O.C. Marsh, Theodore C. Marsh, who was a professor of paleontology at Yale, and Edward Cope, who was an independent researcher from a very wealthy family in Pennsylvania. These two men were engaged in a ferocious rivalry between the two of them to see which could come up with the most discoveries. They were bitterly at odds, and this was big news. This was front page news. This fight between these two guys. Their work was almost entirely out in the West, and they made enormous contributions. But what I've discovered was that, interestingly, much of the work out there in bone hunting and the discovery of these new fossilized species was done by ordinary Westerners, folks on the ground themselves. For example, this fellow, Bill Reed. Bill Reed was a meat hunter for the construction crews of the Union Pacific Railroad in the late 60s and early 1870s. But he was also, like many people were, a kind of a self-taught paleontologist. He was fascinated with it. And so as he was out hunting bison and elk and deer to feed the crews on the railroad, he was also digging up these fossils and with his own self-education, identifying them. And Reed and a friend discovered some of these really interesting fossils in the fossil bed, Como fossil beds in Wyoming. And he sent this telegram back to Marsh saying, we found some really interesting stuff here. They correctly identified what they had found, incidentally, and they asked him to pay him for it. And he did. In fact, he took on Reed as his chief field agent in excavating the Como fossil beds. It was Bill Reed who discovered and excavated this very famous specimen. This is the Diplodocus carnegii. It's a just gigantic dinosaur that's in the Carnegie Museum today in Pittsburgh. Another example, this man, Charles Sternberg. Charles Sternberg, when he was a teenager, went out west to join his brother, who was at Fort Harker in Kansas, this isolated western post. And his brother had a ranch, and so he was helping his brother with the ranch. And as he worked in the ranch, he discovered all kinds of fossils. Started with paleobotany, the fossils of ancient trees that lined this shallow sea that was there on the Great Plains. And he went on from there to searching for fossils of animal life. Here is a Triceratops that Sternberg discovered in the chalk beds of Kansas. It's today in the London Museum of Natural History. I just saw it a couple of years ago. And this was one of many of these major finds that were made by Charles Sternberg. He started out as a ranch kid, fell in love with fossil hunting, and then made these great contributions. So the West then was this extraordinarily active laboratory in this what was arguably, the most important science, one of the most important sciences of the day, where some of the most important breakthroughs were made. And in fact, the two most significant discoveries that helped demonstrate Darwin's ideas of evolution through natural selections were made in the West, and they were made by O.C. Marsh. He was the fellow here in the center, atop, of course. These are all Yale grad students he brought out with him for these expeditions on into the West. What were these two great discoveries? Darwin, of course, was arguing that every living species today, whether we're talking about human beings or about cockroaches, every species is a result of gradual, incremental developments from other species, out of other species, up until today, over all these enormous amounts of time, millions and millions and millions of years. And what he argued was, if you go back into the fossil record, and if you look hard enough, you will be able to trace the gradual step by step evolution that leads up to the species today. And his critics said, well, that's great, prove it. Show us that the links in this evolutionary chain as an example. And Marsh said, okay, and he did. His links, his chain, had to do with horses, the modern horse, Equus caballos. And what Marsh did was collect over many years the bones, focusing especially on the bones of the toes and then hooves of horses over time. And he showed, I think, irrefutably how we can go from step to step to step to create this, to fill in this sort of evolutionary bush. As you can see here in this side of the yellow, is it traces the evolution of the horse through its feet, from the Paracatherium, it's about 50 million years ago, up to the modern horse, Equus caballos. So people questioning Darwin said, show us the proof for it, and Marsh did. Darwin also argued that if you take one of these bushes, like you see here on the screen, and you trace it back, it will, of course, have branched off from another line of evolution And that particular line will have branched off yet another line of evolution. So what you see here is this huge, very complex, enormously fruitful shrub, but every part of it is related to every other part because they all come from a common ancestor. The result of that is we have unexpected relationships among what seem to be very, very different creatures. We know today, for example, that whales are related to bears. And what Darwin was saying is if you trace whales and bears back far enough, you will find that they come from a single beginning. So they're cousins, distant cousins, but still cousins. Well, interesting idea again, but as critics said, show us. Do you have an example of that? And Marsh said, yeah, we do. We do. In 1880, Marsh published this book, Odon Tornathes. And this was designed, this was the book that gave an example of the sort of thing that Darwin was talking about. In particular, Marsh was arguing that these fossilized remains that he found showed conclusively that modern birds are distantly related to modern reptiles. That birds and reptiles come from the same evolutionary branch on the evolutionary tree. To show that, he came up with this remarkable find, Hesperornis regalis. This was a 6 foot long, flightless aquatic bird, avian species. Its leg bones were clearly related to those of early reptiles. There's that. But the real clincher was the fact that if you zeroed in on Hesperornis regalis, looking at the head, you would see that this was a bird with teeth, a toothed bird. And what he was able to show here is this, see here is what's clearly to our eye a bird, and yet it is a bird that has these reptilian connections in its leg bones and its head and its teeth. A toothed bird, Hesperornis regalis. If you translate that from the Latin, it comes out as the royal bird of the West. So by tracing the evolution of the horse, it's about as Western iconic animals I can think of, except maybe the bison, and the royal bird of the West, you can see how Marsh and Pope and others are doing their part to sort of demonstrate the validity of Darwin's very controversial ideas. Darwin thought so. When he received a copy of Odon Tornathes, the next day he wrote back to Marsh and said, this is the most important contribution, the most useful contribution to my ideas of natural selection in the past 20 years. 20 years earlier was the publication of Origin of Species. So what Darwin was saying is, this is the most important confirmation, the most important evidence that we have of these ideas that I came up with. Okay, the West, the modern America is a great scientific powerhouse. Can we see any origins of that if we look back into the West? And I think absolutely we can. As I said, this was the American West during these years was this vital, vibrant laboratory in all of these sizes. The spectacular example here is in paleontology and in geology, but you can find the same sort of things in all of the rest of these. This was really the beginnings of the United States, modern United States, as the world leader in science. The third and final connection has to do with citizenship, or more broadly, the membership of people in America, in the American polity, and the American society, accepted as part of the American family. I think it's fair to say that one of the traits of modern America is that our embrace of more and more peoples, more and more different categories of peoples into the American family has progressively widened as we move from the middle of the 19th century, 1850 or so, into the 20th, and then into the 21st. To put it one way, our unum would become progressively more pluribus. We expand the membership in the American family. At the same time, each of those steps has been resisted, sometimes violently. So this is another, I think, another common trait of modern America: the expansion of the American family, social and cultural and political family, and the resistance and the grinding of gears in that expansion. When you ask yourself that question, when does this start? I think the natural first stab at that would be, of course, emancipation after the Civil War, 1865. After 1865, something like 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans were admitted to, very tentatively, of course, and then imperfectly, into American citizenship. So when I say to you, this trait, if you look for the origins of this particular trait of modern America, you quickly think of this. But when you think of it, this begins earlier than that. It begins with the expansion of the 1840s. With that, we acquire, as our boundaries expand to the Pacific coast, we acquired dozens of the different Indian peoples. You saw that early map that shows that. California is the prime example of this. California is a hodgepodge of many different native peoples speaking mutually unintelligible languages. So it really begins there. And as these people are moving towards citizenship, our government has to ask the question: how do we do this? How do we bring these many different peoples into American society? The basic answer to that, the government, was reservations. We create reservations. We take these native peoples, we put them under these islands, and we use the reservation to sort of reconfigure them, to turn them into what we think of as American citizens, who will all speak English. They will all practice the same. They will also the same ideas of land ownership and of the making of the family, for example. So reservations are considered the sort of the laboratory in which this cultural transformation will occur, that will integrate these very different peoples into a single American society. It was done. The idea was to create this, to accomplish this conversion through bringing them into one economic order as farmers. They begin to they transform from mobile peoples on horseback into farmers. Christianity and education for the young. This is the Peace Medal under Abraham Lincoln. These were medals that were given to native leaders in the West, and you can see the one on the verso from Lincoln himself. You can see in this Peace Medal, this was the vision of the government for this transformation. You see this fellow in the headdress in the foreground, plowing a field. You see a church in the central background back there, and then over to the left you see this schoolhouse where these kids are going to be made into American citizens. If you look closely, you also see they're playing baseball out there in front of the schoolhouse. Now we look back on this and we see this as, of course, culturally arrogant. We see this as an attempted sort of cultural assault, a cultural genocide. And it was all of that. But it was also the official goal of this was to save the Indians by integrating them, making them part of American culture. It was, of course, as I said, an arrogant idea. It didn't work. So you can find a lot wrong with it, but it was based upon the idea that we must save Indians. We must transform them at some point into American citizens. At the same time, however, there was fierce resistance to it. And again, California is a prime example of this. Recent research has emphasized that California, the treatment of Indian peoples in California was in fact a widespread and attempted genocide, destruction of these people. The answer of this answer of some opposed to the government was no, we don't want to make them citizens. We want to kill them. We want to get rid of them, open the land up for full development by non-Indian peoples, white peoples. This chart shows the estimated Native American population in California, 1848, the time of the gold discovery, about 150,000. Within 12 years, it had dropped by more than half. And then a little more than 50 years, it had dropped by 90%. So a horrific story. So what we see here in the West generally, and in California in particular, we see these two sides of this, we will follow into the 20th and 21st centuries of an attempted wider and wider embrace of more people into the American family, at the same time increasing resistance, all along the way, increasing resistance. Same thing could be said about Hispanos in California and in the West. Violence, sort of violent efforts. The Treaty of Guadalupe gave them American citizenship. So on the one hand, just as with Indians, we are supposedly formally welcoming them into the family. But at the same time, there's fierce resistance, especially to their control of resources in the West, these vast resources that are opening up. In California, what you see is Hispanos increasingly marginalized, pushed to the edges, and if there's any resistance to them, if there's any trouble doing it, they're turning to violence in order to impose this racial order on that particular part of the population. One way to show this, we associate violent imposition of a racial order with, of course, the American South in the years after the Civil War, and especially the places like Mississippi, where between the 1880s and 1930s we see this appalling period of lynching. Well, what about Hispanos in the West? Lynching is measured by the lynching rate as the number of lynchings per 100,000 people in a particular place. For Mississippi, this place that we all think of first for this, the rate of number of lynchings per 100,000 people during these years was 53. We have early studies now of the lynching of Hispanos in the Southwest, in California, and in the Southwest. What is that rate compared to that of the South? 473. It's many times, multiple times over the rate that you find among against blacks in the South. So this too, of course, we can see, and same thing true of Chinese, the most culturally anomalous group in American society at that time, coming in many tens of thousands into California. What we see there, of course, is the effort to exclude, first to marginalize, and then to simply exclude Chinese from California and from the United States. In the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the only time in American history when a particular group has been excluded from entry into the United States and to membership in the American family, strictly on the basis of ethnicity, race or ethnicity. So in this question of citizenship and the resistance of the fight over this question of citizenship, well, we might first think of the American South, my part of the country, as a place where this was centered, while the story certainly was unfolding there. It begins in the West, and then it spreads gradually to the East to far greater dimensions. And of course, this too, so we can associate with modern America and America today, in which we see currently a rise in movements of white supremacy, of efforts to exclude certain folks. We have another wall talked about today in our own politics. In this case, not the Chinese wall, but the wall, of course, across our southern border. So I think you hopefully will get the idea that what I'm arguing in this book is that the birth of the American West is crucially important, not just in and of itself, but because it played a vital role in the birth of modern America, the United States of the 20th and 21st centuries that we all know. The two things are inseparable. I call the American West both the midwife and the child of the birth of modern America. It was a product of this transition to modern America. It also helped in that transition and played vitally in that role. The larger point I would hope to get across here is the need to integrate the history of the West generally into the history of the United States on an even larger scale. I think there's a tendency, especially in American popular culture, to think of the West as this exotic place out there. You know, what a recent book is called The American Elsewhere. It's this place out there that's, you know, romanticized. It's thought of as quite different, both in in itself and also in its story from the main course of the American narrative. I think the truth is precisely the opposite, that you cannot possibly understand certainly the history of modern America without bringing the West into it as a prominent player. And with that, I will close and would love to answer any questions that Kevin might be able to moderate.
I'm back. I don't know if you're seeing me. I think
I do.
maybe my video is down. Okay, there we go. Yeah, well, that was fascinating. I was wondering what your book is very large. I was wondering, I have a copy of it here. I was wondering what you were going to pull out from all of those pages to talk to us about. And I think that was terrific. Thank you for making us, I think deeply about how the development of our nation and how we got here today based on the acquisition and development of the West was really transformative in these ways that you talked about as an economic superpower and context of being a scientific leader. And that last one, which we talk a lot about here at the book club in some of our presentations, kind of the cultural transformation that the West was part of in redefining citizenship and all of those efforts.
Yes.
That took place in the
well, thank you. Yes.
That was really super. Lots to think about, lots to read in the book. We do have a good number of questions here, so I'm going to get to them. We do have some time. We're not quite at the top of the hour, so I'm going to kind of come back here and look at some of the ones that came in. There was an interesting question. There's a lot of questions around gold, and we'll get to some of them in a minute. But someone was had a question about the farms that you talked about early on, the kind of the mega processing of farms,
Yeah.
in grain, especially in California. So how were those farms processing grain in California compared to like mega farms now? Like what were they similar in terms of like staffing? How were people paid? And what kind of outputs were they really creating?
Yeah. Certainly there were similarities. They were different in the sense, in the first case, simply of size. Some of these farms were absolutely gigantic. I can't think of any single farms today in the agricultural economy that comes close to that. For example, one in California. Here's an idea of how big this thing was. When it was time to plow, the first plowing in the spring. First of all, they're using this, the most advanced technology and equipment that they have. So this big gang plow pulled by many horses with a bunch of men working on it. So they start in the morning and they start plowing, stop for lunch. They plow to the end of the day. And at the end of the day, they turn the plow around, and the next day they plow the next furrow. So one furrow per day for this farm. Thousands of acres in these things, and they're worked by gang labor, just like some farms are today. They are worked by the most advanced technologies, the most advanced equipment. They're tied into an international market. The so-called grain king of California, a man named Isaac Friedlander, organized this vast network using the telegraph to coordinate grain production, estimates of future grain production for that year. With demand elsewhere. The greatest single market for California grain in these years was England, specifically Liverpool. So people sitting down in Liverpool and in London and in Glasgow and elsewhere, when they sat down in the evening to slice some bread, that bread was probably made from grain that was coming out of the Central Valley of California. So yeah, they are certainly similar in that way. Even larger than farms today, but very similar in the sense of the massive investment needed for those kinds of things, and the international involvement of these farms.
Yeah, there's a quick follow-up question because you used the word gang labor, and can you tell us what gang labor is? What does that consist of?
Well, that is just not individuals working, but in crews. Quite often, these crews were migrant laborers. Quite often, foreign immigrants who have come in. In the case of California, you had a lot of Indians, native peoples working on these farms as farm labor. But you had also coming from Italy, from around the Pacific Rim. This was a massive enterprise.
Right. There's an interesting question here about photography and asking if you could comment on the significance of photography in this time period in terms of American expansion.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the term.
Photography. How
photography. Oh, okay, sure. Yes. One other coincidence. It was during these years, of course, that the art of photography was going through rapid developments, and the West was naturally, one of the great lures for people to go out there. It's this extraordinary story that's going on, this amazing place of what's going on. And so, you had these several examples of people who became master photographers. We have all their archives, of course. People like William Henry Jackson, others, a woman named Cameron out in Montana, Simon Butcher, who photographed all the Great Plains, and this becomes one of the great documentary efforts to try to people were aware this amazing story was unfolding out west, and the photographers using these new techniques were able to give them images of it.
Yeah, that's actually a good pivot to some of these questions about gold, right? Because photography being a lure, right, to come out to California, right. And gold was clearly a lure for people to come out. But there's my good friend Ted is wondering if you could comment on how much of the gold rush might have been really due to the kind of social dislocation, he calls it, from the many revolutions and nation-making activities in Europe during that same time period of people wanting to come here.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the things I did not touch on this evening was the fact that in yet one more coincidence, that the West emerges as a region almost precisely at the same time of what I call the movement revolution. As the greatest advances in human history up until that time, and the ability to move things and people and information through the telegraph over time far more rapidly than they have been able to in the past. What that meant was, Kevin, what that meant was that the West was now accessible. This enormous place was now accessible in a way that no earlier frontier had been. So, some of the consequences of this. Single men are now able to go out to the West, never intending to stay there, intending to make some money before they come back home, or go out there and bring their families back with them. In other words, moving west, which had been, of course, a lifetime commitment. Moving west now was a sojourn. It was something you could do and then go back home. And the consequence of that was you get this extraordinary mobility out west. People moving around. People moving back and forth from east to west. The kind of dislocation, I think, that you're talking about, and our listener was referring to. Yeah. It also incidentally creates the modern phenomenon. One more example of modern America: the vacation. The vacation emerges during these years as an American habit, and predictably, some of the favored vacationing areas from the very beginning are out west. Yellowstone Park being probably the best example of that.
Yeah, it's actually great that you just mentioned Yellowstone, because there's an interesting question in the chat that I think about a lot in terms of the question is, how do we reconcile the tremendous environmental and cultural harms that we did that came out of this entire expansion of the West, with all the pluses, right? With all of the positive things that happen. How do you think, what do you think about that?
That's a great point. The answer to that is you cannot reconcile them, but both of them are clearly true. And that's the final chapter of this book I call Creating the West. And it sort of summarizes some of the main points of this narrative of this, as you said, quite long book. And they include the enormous advantages that the West allowed this country in its development, and the equally enormous environmental convulsions that happened in the West because of this extraordinary destruction of natural resources. California, once again, is a prime example of that, with the effects of hydraulic mining, for example. But you can find the same story unfolding, whether you're looking at the Great Plains or you're looking at the Rocky Mountains or the Great Basin, Pacific Northwest. Think of this. Think of the harvesting of redwoods in the Pacific Northwest. What you're really talking about, because these redwoods can be thousands of years old, of course, individual trees. What you're talking about is the destruction of millions of years of life, mowing down these huge forests of redwoods. So it's both, Kevin. We've certainly taken advantage of that and had great advantages from west, from this, what happens out west, but they paid a terrible cost for it.
So we're just past the top of the hour, and we're not going to be able to get to all of these questions, but there are two more questions that I want to get out there and give you a chance to, talk a little bit about before we wrap up. And one is so interesting because it says that Paul noticed that there was a substantial number of index references in the book to the Mormons, in terms of the history of the American West. So the question, I guess, is, on balance, do you see Mormons as just another part of the story, of the overall pattern of development, or you see them in some different or special way that's maybe contrary to everything else that's happening?
Yeah, well, once again, it's both. Mormons, of course, anomalous in the sense they are. Well, this is the only case we have really in American history on this scale, of an entire society organized at one time. Deseret, is large in the state of Texas today, organized as basically a theocracy. So that's quite different from what's going on elsewhere in the country. On the other hand, what I argue in the book is that Mormonism, the Church of the Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, LDS, is in many ways the most American religion you can think of. It reflects American values. It comes out of course, Western Upper New York State. It expresses many of the basic ideals of American life. And if you want a good way to summarize this, or to sort of sum it up, the great prophet of the church had the most American name I can think of, and that is Joe Smith. Right? So when the church was founded by Joe Smith, that's a pretty American church, I think. So it's both of these, but it's an absolutely critical part of the story of the American West. It's very illustrative, and I try to give it as much attention as I can.
At the beginning of your talk, you asked us to kind of think of some elements or aspects of, to write them down, and then you talked about three of them. And one that I thought you were going to talk about, because I know it's mentioned a number of times in the book, is transportation. Railroads, things like that. Do you want to, even though you didn't incorporate it into your talk, can you talk a little bit about how important all of that was in the development?
Sure. As I mentioned a moment ago, the emergence of the West is absolutely coincidence with what I call the movement revolution. The telegraph was famously demonstrated in May of 1844. What hath God wrought between Morris and Vale? That's a few months before the election of James Polk, who becomes our great expansionist president. It's literally on the eve of this. By 1880, at the end of the period that I looked at, there are tens of millions of telegraph messages crisscrossing back and forth across the country. And during these years also, it's when the railroads expand enormously, including linking the West, bringing the West into the nation, into the world. Great advances in road building. Between 1850 and 1860, 25,000 miles of roads are surveyed and developed in the West. Enough, if you stretch them out into one road, it would be enough to go between San Francisco and Boston 6 times.
Mm.
That is critical to understanding all of these other things that I've mentioned. We could never have developed the West economically as we have without this transportation system. It's through this transportation information system that the scientific advances of the West are spread to the rest of the world. And it was also tied in many ways to the remaking of the racial order in the West too, specifically in the case of Native peoples. So yeah, it's an absolutely critical part that weaves through the larger narrative. Yeah.
The paleontology part was great. I'm glad you included that. That was wasn't what I was thinking, but it was so interesting to hear that. A couple of people have asked about buying the book, and I've put the link into the chat if you're interested in clicking through to Nebraska, University of Nebraska Press to check out the book. I'll also send that out in the email probably tomorrow to everyone who registered for the event. Someone asked me to show the book. It looks like this. I don't know if it's backwards or not on your screen, but I have a copy. You can see it's a good sized book. Check it out. I haven't read the whole thing. I've only been able to slice out a couple of what I thought were going to be really interesting chapters, but I'll try to get through the rest of it. I'll also, Elliott, I'll send you some of these questions because there might be some questions or comments that you're interested in enlightening me on, and I can get back to folks. Sure. But Caroline has one very important question, and it is, what does it say on your hat? We can't see what it says on your hat. I don't know if you want to take your hat off and show us.
It's the cap I got last summer, I believe. I've been active for many, many years in the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which is a wonderful organization in New York. And they had a gathering of teachers, public school teachers, and lecturers in American history in Gettysburg. So this is the hat that was taken from that wonderful gathering to this fabulous organization. I'm sure they sell you one if you want to get in contact with them.
I think it's
let me say also, Kevin, if I would appreciate it if you would send me those questions as well. But let me also invite anyone who wishes to get in touch with me via email. You can go to the site of the History Department of History at the University of Arkansas, and you'll find my email. You'll find my email there. I'd be glad to try to help you out and answer any questions that you might have.
And I'll send that out in the email to everyone who registered too, a contact information and the link to your
great,
your university page. So that will go out to everyone.
Great.
You'll be inundated with all kinds of emails. So Elliott, thank you so much. On behalf of the Book Club of California, I want to thank you for this incredible presentation and for this terrific book. I'm looking forward to reading more of it when I can squeeze that in. So thank you for that. And thank you everyone out there on Zoom for joining us for this presentation this evening. I hope you'll join us for our next event. It's titled Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West. It's a week from tonight, Monday, April 20th. Is that right? That can't be right. 24th, April 24th at 5 p.m. It's going to be a virtual program, just like tonight, with a Zoom audience. And our speaker is historian and author Jerry Ensler. So you can register for that event or any book club event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in any of the program emails that you might be getting from the Book Club of California. So hopefully you'll join us. Thank you again. for being with us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful night. Be well and stay healthy out there. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Kevin and to the club and to all of you who tuned in. Thank you so much.
This was great, Elliott. Thank you.
Mhm.